In Utah, a quiet suburban home concealed a horror that stunned the nation. A mother whose garage became a graveyard for her own newborns. Megan Huntsman was 39 years old when her name became synonymous with one of the most chilling maternal crimes in American history. In 2014, police in Pleasant Grove, Utah, made a discovery that would shock the world: the bodies of 6 newborn infants hidden inside cardboard boxes in her garage. By 2015, Huntsman stood in court, pleading guilty to multiple counts of murder. The case began when her estranged husband, Darren West, was cleaning out the garage of the home they once shared. Inside, he found a small box. What he discovered inside was unthinkable: the remains of a baby. Authorities were immediately called, and a search of the garage revealed 5 more infant bodies, each concealed in similar fashion. The gruesome discovery turned a quiet neighborhood into the center of a national nightmare. Investigators pieced together the timeline. Between 1996 and 2006, Huntsman had secretly given birth to 7 children. 6 of them, she admitted, she killed shortly after birth. Only 1 child survived. The motive, prosecutors argued, was rooted in substance abuse and a desire to avoid the responsibilities of motherhood. Huntsman herself confessed that she was addicted to methamphetamine during those years, and she believed she could not care for more children. The revelations horrified the community. Neighbors who had known Huntsman for years struggled to reconcile the friendly woman they saw with the crimes she confessed to. Parents questioned how such acts could go unnoticed for a decade. The case was not just about one mother's actions. It symbolized the collapse of trust in the most sacred bond, that between parent and child. Courtroom proceedings revealed the depth of the tragedy. Prosecutors described how each infant had been born alive, only to be killed within moments. Huntsman showed little emotion as she admitted her guilt. In 2015, she pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 49 years. For many, the sentence reflected the enormity of the crime: 6 innocent lives taken by the very person meant to protect them. The case ignited national debate. Commentators dissected every detail, questioning how a mother could commit such acts repeatedly over a decade. For some, it symbolized the devastating impact of addiction. For others, it was a chilling reminder that evil can exist behind the most ordinary doors. The story became a cautionary tale, cited in documentaries and news specials as an example of how hidden crimes can fester in silence. In Pleasant Grove, the community struggled to heal. Parents explained to their children why police cars had swarmed their street. Neighbors faced the reality that someone they had trusted was now a convicted murderer. The scandal forced conversations about vigilance, addiction, and the importance of support systems for struggling families. For Huntsman, the guilty plea marked the end of her freedom and the beginning of a legacy defined not by motherhood, but by murder. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, cited in discussions about maternal crimes and the dangers of unchecked addiction. The garage, once a place for storage, was remembered instead as a graveyard. By 2015, the case had become more than a local scandal. It was a national story. It forced conversations about boundaries, accountability, and the vulnerability of children. It reminded society that mothers are held to the highest standard, and when they fail, the consequences ripple far beyond the family. For Megan Huntsman, motherhood was not remembered for nurturing or love, but for a betrayal that turned her garage into a graveyard, a crime forever marked by the silence of 6 newborns. In Virginia, a family home became the stage of betrayal, where a daughter turned against her own mother and sister, driven by greed and deception. Megan Hargan was 37 years old when her arrest shocked the affluent community of MacLeod, Virginia. Behind the walls of her family's home, investigators uncovered a crime that defied comprehension: the murder of her mother, Pamela Hargan, and her younger sister, Helen. What began as a tragedy was soon revealed to be a calculated act of betrayal, staged to look like a murder-suicide. The case began in July 2017, when police responded to a call at the Hargan residence. Inside, they found Pamela and Helen dead. At first glance, the scene suggested that Helen had killed her mother before taking her own life. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. The evidence did not align with the narrative of a murder-suicide. Megan had allegedly attempted to fraudulently transfer money from her mother's bank account to purchase a home. When Pamela discovered the scheme and blocked the transaction, prosecutors argued Megan turned violent. The staged crime scene was designed to deflect blame onto Helen, but forensic evidence told a different story. For 2 years, the case remained under investigation. In 2019, Megan was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture: a daughter consumed by greed, willing to kill her own family to secure financial gain. The courtroom became the stage where betrayal was laid bare. During trial, the prosecution emphasized Megan's calculated actions. They argued that she shot her mother and sister, then manipulated the crime scene to make it appear as though Helen had committed the murders. The defense attempted to cast doubt, but the weight of forensic evidence, including ballistics and digital records, pointed squarely at Megan. The victims, Pamela and Helen, were remembered as vibrant women whose lives were cut short by someone they trusted most. Pamela, a successful professional, had worked tirelessly to provide for her family. Helen, just 23, was described as bright and full of promise. Their deaths left a void that no sentence could ever fill. The case ignited national attention. Commentators dissected every detail, from the financial motive to the staged crime scene. For many, it symbolized the devastating reality that greed can erode even the strongest family bonds. The story became a cautionary tale, cited in documentaries and news specials as an example of how betrayal can lurk behind the facade of domestic life. In MacLeod, the community struggled to process the tragedy. Neighbors who had known the Hargan family were stunned. Parents explained to their children why police cars had swarmed their street. The scandal forced conversations about vigilance, financial pressures, and the unthinkable possibility of violence within families. For Megan, the guilty verdict marked the end of her freedom and the beginning of a legacy defined not by motherhood or family, but by murder. In 2022, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, cited in discussions about maternal crimes and the dangers of unchecked greed. The home, once a place of family gatherings, was remembered instead as the site of a double homicide. By the time of her conviction, the case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a national story. It forced conversations about accountability, the fragility of trust, and the destructive power of financial desperation. It reminded society that even within families, vigilance is essential, because betrayal can come from those closest to us. For Megan Hargan, motherhood and sisterhood were not remembered for love or loyalty, but for a betrayal that turned her family home into a crime scene, a tragedy forever marked by the silence of her mother and sister. In Colorado, a mother's home became the site of betrayal, where an 11-year-old boy vanished, and the truth revealed a crime darker than anyone imagined. Letitia Stotch was 36 years old when her arrest shocked Colorado Springs. Behind the walls of her suburban home, investigators uncovered a crime that defied comprehension: the murder of her 11-year-old stepson, Gannon Stotch. What began as a missing child case quickly unraveled into a chilling story of deception, betrayal, and murder. The case began in January 2020, when Gannon was reported missing. Letitia, his stepmother, told authorities that he had left home to visit a friend and never returned. The community rallied, searching neighborhoods and surrounding areas. Flyers were posted, volunteers combed through fields, and hope lingered that Gannon would be found alive. But investigators soon noticed inconsistencies in Letitia's account. Her statements shifted, details contradicted one another, and evidence began to point toward foul play. Detectives uncovered disturbing signs inside the family home: traces of blood, cleaning supplies, and indications that a violent act had occurred. Surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic evidence painted a grim picture. Prosecutors argued that Letitia had killed Gannon inside the home, then attempted to cover up the crime. His body was later discovered in Florida, hundreds of miles away, after being transported in a suitcase. The discovery confirmed the worst fears: the missing child case was now a homicide. For Gannon's father, Al Stotch, and the community, the revelations were devastating. The boy, described as kind, gentle, and full of promise, had been betrayed by someone entrusted to care for him. The arrest of Letitia transformed the case from a search for a missing child into a courtroom battle for justice. During trial, prosecutors emphasized Letitia's calculated actions. They argued that she murdered Gannon, concealed his body, and misled investigators with false stories. The defense attempted to cast doubt, suggesting mental health struggles, but the weight of forensic evidence, including blood patterns and transport records, pointed squarely at Letitia. The courtroom proceedings revealed the depth of the tragedy. Witnesses described Gannon's gentle nature, his love for video games, and his close bond with his father. Prosecutors highlighted the betrayal of trust, emphasizing that a child's safety had been destroyed by the very person meant to protect him. In 2022, Letitia was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For many, the sentence reflected the enormity of the crime, a mother figure who had turned into a killer. The case ignited national attention. Commentators dissected every detail, from the initial disappearance to the discovery of Gannon's body in Florida. For many, it symbolized the devastating reality that evil can exist within families. The story became a cautionary tale, cited in documentaries and news specials as an example of how betrayal can lurk behind the facade of domestic life. In Colorado Springs, the community struggled to process the tragedy. Neighbors who had joined the search faced the reality that their efforts had been in vain. Parents explained to their children why police cars had swarmed their street. The scandal forced conversations about vigilance, domestic violence, and the unthinkable possibility of maternal betrayal. For Letitia, the guilty verdict marked the end of her freedom and the beginning of a legacy defined not by motherhood, but by murder. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, cited in discussions about maternal crimes and the dangers of unchecked resentment. The home, once a place of family life, was remembered instead as the site of a child's murder. By the time of her conviction, the case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a national story. It forced conversations about accountability, the fragility of trust, and the destructive power of deception. It reminded society that mothers and stepmothers are held to the highest standard, and when they fail, the consequences ripple far beyond the family. For Letitia Stotch, motherhood was not remembered for nurturing or love, but for a betrayal that turned her stepson's disappearance into murder, a crime forever marked by the silence of 11-year-old Gannon. In Massachusetts, a mother's home became the scene of unimaginable tragedy, where 3 young children lost their lives, and questions of crime and mental health collided. Lindsay Clancy was 32 years old when her arrest shocked the quiet town of Duxbury, Massachusetts. A labor and delivery nurse, she was known as a devoted mother and caregiver. But in January 2023, her name became tied to one of the most heartbreaking cases in recent memory: the deaths of her 3 young children. The case began when police responded to a frantic call from Clancy's husband, Patrick. He had returned home to find his children unconscious and his wife injured after an apparent suicide attempt. The children, Cora, age 5, Dawson, age 3, and Callan, just 8 months old, were rushed to the hospital. Despite desperate efforts, all 3 were pronounced dead. Investigators quickly uncovered evidence suggesting that Clancy had strangled her children before attempting to take her own life. The revelation stunned the community. A mother, entrusted with nurturing life, was now accused of ending the lives of her own children. Prosecutors charged Clancy with multiple counts of murder and assault. In court, they described the crime as deliberate, pointing to evidence that she had planned the killings. But the case was far from straightforward. Defense attorneys argued that Clancy was suffering from severe postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, conditions that can distort perception and judgment. The courtroom became the stage for a painful debate. Was this a calculated act of murder, or the tragic consequence of untreated mental illness? Prosecutors emphasized the gravity of the crime, while defense attorneys highlighted Clancy's history of mental health struggles. The victims, 3 innocent children, were remembered as bright, joyful, and full of promise. Their deaths left a void that no sentence could ever fill. For Patrick, the father who discovered the scene, the tragedy was unimaginable. He faced the loss of his children and the reality that his wife stood accused of their murders. The case ignited national attention. Commentators dissected every detail, from the timeline of events to the role of mental health in criminal responsibility. For many, it symbolized the devastating reality that untreated illness can lead to unimaginable outcomes. For others, it was a chilling reminder that even in seemingly stable families, tragedy can strike. In Duxbury, the community struggled to process the tragedy. Neighbors who had known the Clancy family were stunned. parents explained to their children why police cars had swarmed their street. The scandal forced conversations about vigilance, postpartum mental health, and the unthinkable possibility of maternal betrayal. For Lindsay, the arrest marked the end of her freedom and the beginning of a legacy defined not by motherhood, but by tragedy. Her name became synonymous with the painful intersection of crime and mental illness. The home, once a place of family life, was remembered instead as the site of unimaginable loss. By 2023, the case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a national story. It forced conversations about accountability, the fragility of trust, and the importance of mental health support for mothers. It reminded society that while mothers are held to the highest standard, they are also vulnerable to struggles that can have devastating consequences if left untreated. For Lindsay Clancy, motherhood was not remembered for nurturing or love, but for a tragedy that turned her children's laughter into silence, a crime forever marked by the collision of family, betrayal, and mental illness. In Utah, a mother's home became the center of suspicion, where a husband's sudden death revealed a chilling story of poison, deception, and betrayal. Curry Richens was 33 years old when her arrest shocked Summit County, Utah. A mother of 3 and a real estate agent, she was known in her community as ambitious and outgoing. But in March 2023, her name became tied to one of the most sensational cases in recent memory: the alleged poisoning of her husband, Eric Richens. The case began in March 2022, when Eric was found dead in the couple's home. Curry claimed she had prepared him a celebratory drink after closing a major real estate deal. Hours later, Eric was discovered unresponsive. Toxicology reports revealed a lethal dose of fentanyl in his system, 5 times the amount considered fatal. The revelation transformed what seemed like a tragic accident into a suspected homicide. Investigators uncovered disturbing details. Evidence suggested that Curry had purchased fentanyl pills from an acquaintance weeks before Eric's death. Prosecutors argued that she had slipped the drug into his drink, deliberately poisoning him. The motive, they claimed, was financial. Curry allegedly sought to secure control over Eric's life insurance policies and assets. The case gained national attention not only because of the allegations, but also because of Curry's actions after Eric's death. Just months later, she published a children's book about grief, titled, "Are You With Me?" The book, intended to help children cope with loss, was promoted in interviews and public appearances. For many, the irony was chilling. A mother accused of causing her children's grief was now profiting from it. Courtroom proceedings revealed the depth of the allegations. Prosecutors presented evidence of text messages, drug purchases, and financial disputes between Curry and Eric. They argued that she had planned the poisoning carefully, motivated by money and resentment. The defense countered that the case was circumstantial, emphasizing that Curry maintained her innocence. The victim, Eric Richens, was remembered as a devoted father and successful businessman. Friends described him as generous and hardworking, a man who loved his family deeply. His sudden death left a void that no trial could ever fill. For his children, the tragedy was compounded by the reality that their mother stood accused of killing their father. The case ignited national debate. Commentators dissected every detail, from the alleged poisoning to the publication of the grief book. For many, it symbolized the devastating reality that betrayal can lurk behind the facade of family life. For others, it was a chilling reminder of how financial motives can drive unimaginable acts. In Summit County, the community struggled to process the scandal. Neighbors who had known the Richens family were stunned. Parents explained to their children why police cars had swarmed their street. The case forced conversations about vigilance, financial pressures, and the unthinkable possibility of maternal betrayal. For Curry, the arrest marked the end of her freedom and the beginning of a legacy defined not by motherhood, but by suspicion. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, cited in discussions about maternal crimes and the dangers of unchecked greed. The home, once a place of family life, was remembered instead as the site of a suspected poisoning. By 2023, the case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a national story. It forced conversations about accountability, the fragility of trust, and the destructive power of financial desperation. It reminded society that mothers are held to the highest standard, and when they fail, the consequences ripple far beyond the family. For Curry Richens, motherhood was not remembered for nurturing or love, but for suspicion that turned a family's grief into betrayal, a crime forever marked by the silence of her husband, Eric. In Florida, a neighborhood dispute escalated into tragedy, where a mother's anger turned deadly, and a community was left searching for justice. Susan Lawrence was 58 years old when her arrest shocked the community of Ocala, Florida. A mother living in a quiet apartment complex, she became the center of national headlines in June 2023 after fatally shooting her neighbor, Ajike A.J. Owens, during a heated dispute. The case began with ongoing tensions between Lawrence and Owens, a 35-year-old mother of four. Neighbors reported that arguments had flared repeatedly over children playing in the area. Lawrence allegedly complained about noise and trespassing, while Owens defended her children's right to play freely. The conflict simmered for months, creating an atmosphere of hostility. On June 2, 2023, the dispute reached its breaking point. According to investigators, Owens approached Lawrence's home after Lawrence had yelled at her children and allegedly thrown objects at them. The bullet struck Owens, killing her instantly. The shooting ignited outrage. Owens was remembered as a devoted mother, described by friends and family as kind, hardworking, and deeply protective of her children. Her death left 4 children without their mother, sparking grief and anger across the community. Initially, Lawrence claimed self-defense, citing Florida's controversial Stand Your Ground law. She argued that she feared for her safety when Owens confronted her. But investigators and prosecutors challenged that narrative. They emphasized that Owens was unarmed, that the shot was fired through a closed door, and that Lawrence's actions reflected hostility rather than fear. In June 2023, Lawrence was arrested and charged with manslaughter, assault, and culpable negligence. Courtroom proceedings revealed the depth of the tragedy. Prosecutors presented evidence of prior complaints, hostile interactions, and the fatal shot that ended Owens's life. The defense attempted to argue that Lawrence acted out of fear, but the weight of testimony and forensic evidence pointed to recklessness. The case ignited national debate. Commentators dissected every detail, from the neighborhood tensions to the invocation of Stand Your Ground. For many, it symbolized the devastating reality of how disputes can escalate into violence. For others, it was a chilling reminder of how firearms can turn ordinary conflicts into deadly encounters. In Ocala, the community struggled to process the tragedy. Vigils were held in Owens's honor, with neighbors and activists demanding justice. Parents explained to their children why police cars had swarmed their street. The scandal forced conversations about race, neighborhood safety, and the responsibilities of gun ownership. For Lawrence, the arrest marked the end of her freedom and the beginning of a legacy defined not by motherhood, but by violence. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, cited in discussions about neighborhood disputes and the dangers of unchecked anger. The apartment, once a place of family life, was remembered instead as the site of a fatal shooting. By late 2023, the case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a national story. It forced conversations about accountability, the fragility of community trust, and the destructive power of fear and hostility. It reminded society that mothers are held to the highest standard, and when they fail, the consequences ripple far beyond their own families. For Susan Lawrence, motherhood was not remembered for nurturing or love, but for a fatal act that turned a neighborhood dispute into tragedy, a crime forever marked by the silence of her neighbor, Ajike Owens.